Andrew, thank you for joining us here today. I know it'll be fun for a lot of our common audience to actually hear from you. A lot of them see you putting conferences together and a lot of the events that you've worked on, and they're like, but who's Andrew? So without talking about your current career, can you tell us a bit about Andrew Bowyer and who you are?
It's a good question, Gary. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me on your podcast series. I'm honored to be interviewed by you, and it's normally I'm the one doing the interviewing, so you're gonna put me on the spot today. So yeah, who am I? I started my company in 2018, which is called ADB Insights. And what it is a media company focused on change and innovation in the professional services space. And so underneath that, we have our main brand is called the Canadian Legal Innovation Forum. We also have something called the Canadian Estates Forum, but the main thing is the Canadian Legal Innovation Forum, or affectionately known as CANLIF. And prior to that, I grew up in British Columbia. I left after my undergrad. I moved to the UK. I started my career with the Financial Times in London, and I was with them for about 5 years. Then I moved to Bloomberg, and I was with them in London and New York and London again over a 7-year stretch. And then a consulting firm focused on innovation in the global legal sector, related to my time at the FT for about a year. And then I met someone who suggested that there's lots of innovation going on in the Canadian legal sector, and I decided to return to Canada and set up the Canadian Legal Innovation Forum. So that was 4.5 years ago now. So.
And that I love the synopsis. Now you had a variety of experience, very diverse experiences.
Yeah.
If you could go back and give some advice to your 18-year-old self, or rather a piece of advice, what would it be?
That would be that you should focus on a career or line of work that you are passionate about, if you can, or that you're interested in, and trust that with hard work and some flexibility that it will all play out to something positive, even though at the time it may not seem apparent at points in your career, especially when you're starting out. Sometimes jobs can be quite boring, quite tedious, but if you're doing the right thing in the right space that you're interested in, then and you're aware of your skill set, then I think it works out. So, yeah.
I can completely appreciate that, and I think it will resonate with a lot of the listeners. Andrew, when you're not working, what keeps you busy?
So what do I like to do in my spare time? Well, you're speaking to entrepreneur, Gary. So, as you know, you have a lot to do with work, and I think you and I share a common thread that we both enjoy what we do very much, and are passionate about our respective businesses, and so that takes up a lot of my time. Other things that I like to do in my spare time. I like to ski. I like to play golf. I like to go to the gym and work out, although I need to do that more often these days. Friends, family, partner, that stuff.
Andrew, can you tell us about someone that has really impacted your life, or rather, someone that impacted your life the most? Because I know there's many people that shape us to who we are, but if you were to be selective.
Yeah, so I think impacted my life the most?
I know
Do you
it's
mean
hard.
a professional or personal context?
And I think if you'd like, you could give both. If sort of
Sure.
that way you don't have to. We'll allow two if it makes it simpler.
Yeah, sure. I think obviously, I think in my personal life, I would have to say my parents. Um, they obviously were very supportive of me finding my own path, and also having a view on the world that was pretty open to experiences. Both my parents are British, so I have a British passport. That's how I ended up in the UK, and so very open to traveling, exposure to what's out there in the world, and seizing the day, seizing opportunities. Um, yeah, so that would be the parents front. Professionally, um, I think there probably, you know, uh, there's a number of different people I think that have had pretty big impacts on my career to date. Uh, at my time at the FT, um, I remember the head of the European business um, kind of really put me forward when I was at quite a young age to run a very exciting part of the paper's business when I was about 25, 26, which was a real jumpstart to my career. And then I had a boss there who was pretty impactful. He's now a very senior person with the FT. After that, in terms of teaching me, focus on what things to focus on in business and how to make it happen, and um, don't just do whatever it takes to accomplish things, and see you know around see around problems, instead of seeing them as problems, just sort of always focusing on solutions to those challenges. I also think so that was one part, and I'm speaking kind of generally, because I think there was a number of people in my career who've had significant impacts. Um, so I think that time at the FT, a lot of the business that I have now is based on my experiences there. And what I consider my business is to be a media company, and we're focused on a very specific vertical. Right now, law, although I think we're talking about perhaps doing some more exciting things in other professional services sectors, Gary. So watch this space. And so that informed a lot of my sort of focus on how I do things and understanding the business model and being very clear about why I'm doing things the way I am. So that was sort of the first half of my or first third of my career. Now, I think working for Bloomberg, much different type of business, quite different from what I'm doing now. Actually, most of the work I was doing there was very different, but there I learned about innovation and collaboration, and that was a really big part of my learning in my career. Um, and that is Bloomberg is a very collaborative, innovative, driven company. I mean, there's a reason why Michael Bloomberg is one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his era, um, arguably the most, but perhaps that's because I was there a long time. But that sort of way of working, um, working with colleagues, the amazing thing about working for that company is that you would be doing something different every year. So they'd sort of put you on a different path or project or region. So I traveled all over the world with them. So I learned how to do business all across the world: Latin America, Europe, the US, Canada, the Middle East. Pretty much the only place I didn't do business with Bloomberg was Asia. But that was a huge amount of exposure, working in a very international environment. So if you think about your colleagues, all of your colleagues would actually be from different countries, literally, especially in London. You'd have 6 or 7 people sitting on your pod of desks. Nobody has an office at Bloomberg, even Michael Bloomberg. Everybody works open plan, very much down to basic stuff. So that exposure of working, with different people to solve quite interesting problems that were always sort of coming up, or challenges, I guess is a better term. And so that collaboration piece and the innovation part, being able to move with things, refocus, don't hold on to things that aren't working. If a part of your business isn't working, move on. It's not necessarily your fault. Don't play the blame game. All that kind of stuff, I think, really informed my approach. So in many ways, those kind of experiences really melded together, and I think has led to what I'm doing now to be successful to date. I mean, I would say it's gone well so far, and I'm pleased about that.
Andrew, I really appreciate that background. I think it's helpful to our listeners as well to understand a bit about sort of your evolution. Now, I want to get a bit more specific. What inspired you to start your current business and to pursue the sort of the current state of affairs, so to speak?
Sure. Yeah. So I always wanted to have my own business. I think, although I've just sort of gone through a 5 minute monologue about the things that I learned working for large companies and corporations, I think in the back of my mind, I always wanted to do my own thing eventually. And so that sort of confluence of a few things, and then basically finding an opportunity in the Canadian market that worked, and that just sort of got things moving, really, for the inspiration to start my business. I guess it was the right time, right place. Personally and professionally, I wanted to return to Canada. Got introduced to the right people, and it just kind of happened. Although I say that now, it was a lot of hard work and a big risk to start the business. But once it got going, I had a very clear picture of what it was to be, and what I wanted it to be, and that's been really rewarding as time goes on. Met great people, present company included, and I think going back to what I was talking about before, all those skills that I learned abroad in those contexts, which I think is quite unique experience, gave me the sort of toolkit to be able to start this business. So.
Now, starting any business, Andrew, has its own challenges, and the naturally you've gone through a variety, I'm sure. What would you say were some of the biggest challenges that you encountered, and how did you overcome them?
Sure. So the biggest challenge when I started the business was that I didn't know many lawyers in Canada. Right. So that was a starting point that I needed to address. And nobody knew about the brand. And I think in some contexts, the concept of innovation in the legal sector is a bit of it's a challenging concept. There's a lot of resistance to it, and I'm not necessarily sure the Canadian market was open to that idea when I started the business. Although I think I would think part of it, the business itself has helped it become a part of the roadmap in Canada, or created a clearinghouse for people to discuss this kind of stuff and network with each other. And I think there is a broad trend going on in the sector too. So I caught it at the right time. So the challenge was at the beginning was to get your name on the map and establish credibility that you were going to be able to do this, right? And so at first, the thing that funds conferences is sponsors. I kind of liken it to it's like a film production or TV producer business. Let's say film business. You say, I have this idea. Do you want to fund it because it's going to pay this dividend back to you? But it's really just sort of a bit ethereal at that point, especially when you're starting out, because you have no track record. So the hardest part was to kind of prove yourself, keep your expectations low, particularly financially, the first few years were tricky, right? That's an entrepreneur's thing you have to be prepared for, is that if you're working in a corporate job, high flying corporate job, whatever, your expectations of having the same compensation out the doors, I think you probably need to check that. Um, but the big challenge was sort of getting getting plugged into the network, uh, making the case to people that this was an idea worth investing in, and then delivering. And Gary, we've talked about this. I mean, the big part in this business again is you've got to deliver and you've got to execute. So it's all great. The ideas are great, and that's perfect. Here's the big themes. That's hard in itself to come up with. What's the sort of um, driving forces that need to be pulled into one thing that will draw people into a room to spend a day of their time to attend. That's one part. And then the other part is to make sure you execute and make sure it runs smoothly, efficiently, doesn't waste people's time. And then, from a branding point of view, which I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this, and obviously we partner together, strategic partners, is how are you working with your sponsors and your partners? What are they trying to get out of it? And I think that actually has been a unique selling point for me, which I was aware of at the beginning, was what do sponsors want to do? And or I call them partners, that's a better term. What are they trying to accomplish out of this? Like really understanding that and working closely with them to give them as much value as possible. And I think when you look at the conference market as it stood, um, I'm not sure all the producers think about that. They just say, we're putting on a conference. It happens every year, does what it says on the tin. This is what the price is for this and this and this, and you can take it or leave it because it's the only game in town. Well, I kind of took a different approach because I'm a business person too, right? So I also know, if a lot of my companies are the partners are technology companies and they're selling enterprise services. That's something I did for Bloomberg. So I understand what it means to sell enterprise platforms and all the things. Now, the different markets, different kind of thing, totally different thing, but the fundamentals are the same. And I think that really resonates with people. And I think it's helped a lot to have deep partnerships. And then, like I said, good ideas and then execute well. So those, I guess, are the three things. A little bit off the top this morning, but
No, and certainly the those are important, right? Because that's what people go through, and certainly having that perspective of somebody that has been in the shoes of a lot of the sponsors is important. It helps you relate.
yeah,
But also, these tips will really resonate with entrepreneurs that are going into a new market where they're like, look, I understand this particular business, but I don't understand necessarily the demographic I'm going into. So it's sort of knowing how to wrap their mind around, I'm going to work with insurance, for example. What does that look like? And I know that I can add value by doing this and this, but I don't know how to penetrate the market.
yeah.
So I'm gonna go back to the legal innovation, legal technology, and ask your thoughts into how do you think that will evolve, that market and that space will evolve over the next few years.
Yeah. So my observation to date is that, um, you know, and I think this applies to all professional services, but we focus on the legal sector. So I think the guiding principle is, um, if you signed up just to be a lawyer, when you do law school and you finish law school and you start articling in whatever path you're choosing, um, I think that's changing. That you do have to have, a business mindset as well, um, and a flexible mindset, which is not always doesn't always come easy, right? Because in the legal sector, lawyers are trained to look at risk, right? That's what they get paid to do, is here's all the risks and here's how to navigate those risks, right? And so part of business is taking risks. And so I think that mindset part of things is changing. And so it's not just enough to be a lawyer, you've got to have other skill sets as well, right? And that could be, creative, learning creative, innovative approaches or mindsets to challenges you face. kind of what I was talking about too. Where do you fit into the value chain, right? Because you are operating, usually functioning, either you're working, if you're in-house, you're working for a business. If you're in a larger law firm, you're working, your clients are businesses, right? So and then obviously, when it comes to sort of smaller law, they're focused on consumers. But I think that comes back to the point about the end user. So, what's the end user wanting out of this experience collaborating with you, right? And I think that's another sort of part of how things are changing, and that's one of the things that I like to focus on. Um, Legal innovation generally, again, when I started the forum, I always looked at the framework of people, process, and technology. So oftentimes it just defaults to legal tech. Tech, you need to have people bought in to new ways of doing things, and then the tech underpins it. That's the people, process, technology. So if you're looking at it through that framework, then you're setting yourself up for success. So don't just look to technology as just sort of a panacea. I think there's, looking at those things in tandem is how innovation really happens and how change really happens, and it's not that easy. Um, to answer your question about what I think is going to happen, I don't think there's fundamental things that change everything. Although there's a lot of um, pardon the pun, chat about Chat GPT right now. And our next conference in Toronto, we'll talk about that a little bit. Um, but I would be wary that there's one thing that's going to sort of just be just a total game changer. I think there's a lot of things that are coming along. And I think the whole thing is about making processes more efficient, people adopting different mindsets and being open to change. And then these technologies that are exciting, that are emerging, but they're not taking jobs away, they're supporting people to do the jobs. I think the big thing is that business models probably will change in time, right? And the question is how quickly. But my observation is that change is a bit slower than we necessarily think, and there's lots of room for lawyers to continue doing their job and probably enjoying their jobs more if they adopt this innovation, because the repetitive dull tasks can be outsourced. So that's kind of, again, this is a fairly long-winded thesis about this. I think the other thing is the ecosystem is changing, right? So again, how I frame it is I don't like the term vendor. I like to call them third party partners. So vendor, just for everybody to understand, is like technology or service providers to either law firms or in-house counsel. I like to call them the third party partners. And that's how I really also am interested in. And I think, again, one of the focuses of the innovation forum is the legal ecosystem. And that's and how that's evolving, right? How new players are emerging, new providers are emerging, how that fits into the context of law firms and in-house relationships. And personally, I believe that all three working together is what is basically enabling success. Um, I don't think it's necessarily, um, a winner takes all kind of scenario, right? Um, yeah, so I don't have any huge predictions other than I do see that the challenges and opportunities are evolving, but I don't think it's something that's happening, on a widespread basis. And I think it just depends on what area of the legal sector you're looking at. And I think that those sort of all those things I just talked about, if people are aware of those, then they can, you know, kind of get into the stream of innovation, right? And whatever joining point, like it's not like you're missing out on everything if you haven't started, but if you start, again, attending our programs, conferences, getting built into that network, plugged into that network, that will help you kind of really evolve your practice. So um, I think it's an exciting time.
I completely agree with you, and there is the evolution is sometimes far slower than we think, despite the technology capabilities out there. I'm going to sort of ask the question a little in a different prism, because a lot of the listeners will be from in-house legal departments and lawyers, and some of them in their innovation departments. Uh, the because of the amount of conference you put together and the speakers you have had the opportunity to listen to, you've distilled some of this information. What tips would you have for in-house legal departments or departments at law firms on how they can best prepare for the evolution that is coming?
Sure. Um, I think you should attend my conferences and webinars to begin
Absolutely.
with. So I would say that. I think I think that I think the thing that so there's lots of so first of all there's lots of like good podcasts out there, lots of articles written. There's newsletters you can subscribe to. Particularly in the U.S., there's a lot of content that gets produced, and so you can kind of get your head around what the key trends are. And if you have time, of course, lawyers like to read, so or maybe they don't like to read because that's their job. But that you do, if you can get your head around that sort of context as it relates to you through engaging with different platforms to learn, I think that's a starting point. So again, like my example, we produced lots of webinars. They're all free on canlif.net. And you can go watch. There's a large body of work that we've produced. I think that's one part. I think plugging into networks too, right? You know, what I notice, and Gary, we did our conference in Montreal last week, which were a founding partner of our first conference. There are like-minded people out there, and the thing that's interesting about in-house is um, you don't necessarily cross paths with these people because your businesses are totally different sectors, but ultimately the problems you share and the challenges you face are fundamentally often the same. So if you have, again, we have panelists from, large conglomerates, financials, all sorts of financial institutions, engineering companies, and they're all kind of talking about this. Insurance companies all talking about the same kind of challenges they face, even though they operate in different businesses. And also that goes for companies that are, it's interesting. I always observe, there is some similarity on a sectoral basis. And so say you're working at a large bank, well, you have a lot to learn from your colleagues at other large banks, even though your institutions are competing with each other. You have in some ways more in common as in-house lawyers. So I think those are kind of two parts of advice. And also, read the financial press, read the business press, understand what's going on in the business world, and where, again, we're assuming, these are, you're working in businesses. Not every in-house lawyer, they often work in government too. It's different. But, where does your company or what's going on in the context of the business, understanding the business? Because I think that's, again, a big challenge that's set out to in-house lawyers is adding value to the business, right? So that's kind of, I think, my three parts of advice is a, there's lots of information out there, lots of reading material on what legal innovation is, lots of you know lots of content out there you can engage with. Find a network of local people that are interested in the same thing, so you feel that you're supported in your path, and don't be scared that you don't know anything to start with, right? That you're just interested, because it's a very welcoming community of people to the innovation stuff. And then understand where your role fits into the bigger context of the environment your business, the company you work for, is operating in, and take steps to understand that better.
Uh, Completely excellent advice, and I think it'll resonate with our audience. So I appreciate that, Andrew. Um, and I may get back to a couple of these tips. Frankly, to your point, attending the conferences has a lot of these answers. Maybe at one point you should be putting a book together of like tips that I've accumulated over time. So,
That would be nice. Yeah.
but Andrew, the naturally starting a business is demanding and time and energy, etc. How do you find the balance time wise between personal life and work life, and keep the energy levels so that you are present for both?
Yeah, good question. It is hard to balance life, right, as a entrepreneur and having the rest of your life. So I think as in time, like try to focus your time when you're working, and when you're not working, you're not working. Um, I try to not work on Saturdays if I can help it, and Sundays too, if I can afford not to. Um, and try to sort of you know plan accordingly, take on work that you can do, um, and you can fit into the rest of your life. But I won't lie. It's not. The entrepreneurial path is one that you have to have that self belief and drive, and you have to like it what you're doing a lot, and be willing to put in that effort and time and take those risks on. And sometimes it does. Um, it can be hard to balance things, right? Luckily in my business and yours and Gary, I think we share this in common, is that it's a lot about networking. So luckily, you're not your work is people a lot of the time. So that's a fun part of it too, right? So that kind of working with people or colleagues that you like to work with, and that adds an element as well. Yeah, and then obviously make time to take breaks, go on holiday, have other interests outside of work as well. Um, yeah, and pursue those.
Now, naturally, Andrew, you go through certain cycles when you're just before a conference or certain more intense part of the year.
Yeah.
What productivity tips would you share with the audience, or what have you found works really well? Because now you will have times that are extremely intense, and we know some of the audience does live very intense lives, so to speak.
Yeah. Productivity tips. Make a list every week of your major projects. So what are the big things you're working on, and what are the sub points that need to be dealt with, and then compress them into smaller lists of five. Set out 5 points a day. Here's what I want to do today. And I think a big thing is like focusing on, and I've forgotten there's some sort of matrix or something out there, but and I think it was from a US president in the 50s or something. It was like sort of what matters most. So being able to define like what is the most mission critical stuff that you need to accomplish to get to the goal, and what's the stuff that's sort of secondary that you can kind of work on afterwards, right? And I think that's, as an entrepreneur, I think that's an interesting thing, because I think in organizations, oftentimes there's a lot of administration and stuff that you get held up in. As an entrepreneur, you have no choice but to cut through to what matters most. Otherwise, you don't succeed, right? So being able to see that, I think also being able to see with time and experience around the corners of where things might go wrong. So if you can see, if this doesn't happen, I mean, in my business is very sequential. If you don't do this, this, and this at this point, then you're setting yourself up for problems, which is going to make life a lot more stressful in a few months' time. And it depends what you're doing, but in my business is an end point. A conference is happening on a date, and that is a specific point in time that you can't change that date, right? There's the day before, a day of, and the day after. So you've got to kind of just make sure you're seeing around the corners to address those, and I think that keeps the balance. And also, yeah, and just continue persisting too, right? And times will be really intense, and then it's a great feeling when these things get accomplished and your business is growing and moving on to the next thing.
And absolutely, Andrew, resilience and, to your point, persistency are critical to success. Uh,
Absolutely.
Now, we talked a little bit about what advice you'd give to yourself as at 18, and I'm going to go a bit further and say, when you started this business, if you were to go back to yourself a few years ago when you started this business and give yourself a tip on knowing what you know now, what you would have done a little differently, perhaps to focus differently or to approach it slightly differently, what would you have? What advice would you have given to yourself?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, at the beginning, of course, a lot of pressure that whether it was going to work or not, and stressing about that. But of course, at the time, it's hard in retrospect to say, "Oh, I shouldn't have stressed out about those small things," right? And because it worked out in the end. But it's really hard to say whether worrying about those things or being focused on those things made the difference, right? Because ultimately, again, starting a business is stressful. It's just a different kind of lifestyle that you lead. Um, I don't know if I did anything, I would do anything differently. The thing that is interesting about my business when I started it is I started it at one thing, which is a live conferences business. And then we had COVID, which was a really existential moment, March 2020, for a lot of people in their own ways. For people running a business where you had to have people meeting in conference rooms, very existential moment. Like you couldn't think of anything. Um, I couldn't think of anything worse. I mean, at that point in time, was like, what could we, what do we do? We can't be in a room together. So that was, so my business has been like, I had to innovate too. That was a real, like a moment that was really tested the metal of how innovative are you really. Like, it's great that you're putting on a conference about innovation, but you're putting on a conference. It's a well trodden path to some extent. It's, conferences are nothing new. I think I have a fresh approach, but we got completely hit with an asteroid, which completely changed everything. So I had to be very innovative at that point in time to evolve and keep my business going. And that was going virtual. So I haven't had a lot of time to ponder what I would have done differently. Like, it might, if it was a bit more linear and we didn't have COVID, then I might be able to have some more lessons learned. Other than don't sweat the small stuff. Easy to say in retrospect, hard to say now. And I think, Gary, you're nodding, so you totally appreciate it, because again, as an entrepreneur, as the business grows, you sweat the small stuff anyway the whole way along. So it's quite, but I think maybe not, learning how to manage the stress around that would be on a personal front, probably part of what could be done better. Um, but yeah, I think strategically, I don't think there was anything that I really would have done differently. My main strategy during COVID was, uh, all bets are off, completely virtual, and do not worry about doing a live conference again until it's time to do live conferences again. And so I think that gave me a real edge, because and luckily, like, again, I also goes back to I think the initial statement, that we talked about, which was, um, what would you teach your younger self? Is go with the flow, right? Like, life presents opportunities and life presents challenges, and you've just got to kind of roll with it. And that goes on all fronts, right? Business and personal, professional. Um, and um, and I had been, consulting for Bloomberg Law in 2019, and helping them put on webinars for the U.S. market. So they were doing these sponsored webinars for various different topics on U.S. topics, and I knew some people at Bloomberg. I was starting out, so I needed revenue besides just my conferences. And I was doing some consulting. I learned how to put on webinars, and I was like, already this was a brilliant idea. I thought this should be done in CANLIF. So I was pitching it to sponsors. At the time, there wasn't a huge amount of interest. It was like, what's a webinar? Like, why would we do that? We just want to sponsor your conference. But as soon as the pandemic happened, then some of the sponsors said, what are you doing? I said, well, webinars. I was telling you about those webinars. What can you do them? Well, I put them on for Bloomberg. So yeah, I know in principle how to do them, right? And I'll figure out how to do it. And then that's really was a game changer for the business because we just moved ahead. I think we put 100+ hours of virtual content. We're still putting on webinars. And I think that was a real confidence builder because you were able to overcome that. And you basically created a whole new business on the spot. And that gave me a lot of confidence that I was innovative too, right? And then so when it's time to come back to live events again, which our first one, we were very aggressive coming back. We took a big risk. May 2022 was our first live conference. People, I know in the collective mind in Toronto in April, people were worried that we're going to have to shut down because of COVID again. I was worried too, but I pressed forward. I made that decision December 2021. We're going to take this risk and do it. And I think things will be okay. And it paid off. And then you came back and said, look, we all had to be innovative, right? Present company included. So that's again like a long-winded answer to your question. I hope I haven't gone too far off track here, but those kind of things that you taught what you would have known before or learned about or thought you could have done differently. I don't really think there's anything we could have done differently. Now, I think actually the challenge in the new context is what does that new context look like? That's probably at this point is how do you kind of shore things up and where's the business going now? So yeah.
And Andrew, you had some great advice built in what you just said, because one of the most important things entrepreneurs go through is pivoting, because you may have a general idea of where you want to get to, so it's here, but it's never really a straight line, not even like a wavy line. It's huge zigzags in terms of how you get there. And
Yeah.
that requires a level of flexibility. It's not something that happens with just, you set out with a business plan. If that business plan had exactly what you did every week, I guarantee you those weeks won't look the same as you get to the final timeline. So
Yeah, and that's it, right? I think that's like again, that's would I have thought I never I mean I always plan, but a lot of it's intuitive too, right? And a lot of it's going with the flow and things that are opportunities. Now, where you got to work as an entrepreneur, I think a real key thing is identifying an opportunity that makes sense for your business and that you're going to invest time and ultimately money in to do, right? And it's got to make sense, and there's got to be sort of an end game here that you say, okay, if I'm going to start doing this market's going to make a lot of sense and I can grow it and it will be worth it. It's not just a one-off kind of thing. And I think that flexibility, right? Like you do have a roadmap, and I think strategy and planning is important. But I do think what COVID taught all of us, we couldn't have thought. I know in the news they'd said, or Bill Gates had said, pandemic's going to be the biggest thing that in 2016 or whatever, but none of us expected that to happen. We all had to work on the fly, right? And so that's the thing, is you always got to have a strategic plan, but plans will change, right? So
the only consistent change by the plans is that they will evolve. So
that's right. Yeah, that's right. So I think having that mindset of looking at opportunities, having a general, here I want to accomplish this is what I want the business to look like, financially, or from whatever your creative perspective of what you envision for it, but be flexible on that road and expect twists and turns.
yeah, Andrew, I'm a great advice built in, and I think it will really resonate. I am switching to a slightly different aspect of our podcast, and a fun one. I really enjoy it. So we call it the one-word rapid fire questions. And what I'm looking for from you is sort of the first thing that comes to mind. You don't have to overthink it. It's supposed to be a fun thing. So,
Okay, yeah, usually I'm not good with one word because as you just seen it.
well, that's what makes it fun. All right. So if you're ready, what is
Yeah,
your favorite word?
collaboration.
Excellent. See, you're great.
Thank
Uh,
you.
what word do you hate?
uh, Can't be done.
It
That's three
cannot
words.
be done. We can just, even if we said can't, I think it can really it can really give the same effect. So I agree with you. What word do you have a hard time pronouncing?
Prescient.
I think a lot of people would have that challenge. What is your favorite word in another language, if you have one?
I don't have one.
That's completely okay. And I think having spoken French at the conference last week, everyone presumes you speak French. But for the audience, do you speak any other languages?
No, no, and I don't speak French either, but
No,
I practice my speech a lot.
no one would have known that last week, Andrew. You did great.
Thank you, Gary.
One word to describe yourself.
Driven.
See, you're doing great with the one word answers. And the last one, this one is no longer a one word answer, is if you could have coffee with any historical figure, who would you choose?
Uh, Barack Obama.
Yeah, it's I love the I love the context and your choices. Very well. Any particular reason why Barack Obama?
I think he's a fascinating person, and has a very interesting life story, um, and relatable in the sense that life is a journey, right? And there's and an adventure, and who knows where you will end up, right? If you embrace that as it is an adventure. So I found him to be a very inspirational person, and I've never met him, but his speeches, his writing, um, obviously, being president, I, even though we're in Canada, but I think that would be someone I'd be very excited to meet.
Well, Andrew, I tell you what, as your conferences get bigger and more reputable, eventually we can invite him as a guest speaker at one of the conferences, and then you'll have an opportunity to meet him.
That would be fabulous. Yeah, yeah,
And
that's right.
unlike some historical figures that are far back in history, him you can still have coffee with, which is great.
That's true. Yeah, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but
No, it
I'll, I'll
does. It does very much because historically, just gives you the opportunity to even go back to people that are in a different era, but not that you have to go to. It just gave you bandwidth, but not so that you necessarily went back that far back. Uh, Andrew, I really appreciate your time today. I think there's been some great insights shared and in a consolidated fashion. And it's hard sometimes to distill questions to try to grasp a lot of what you've learned over time and sort of your evolution as a person. I think the CANLIF has done a lot for the legal community, and it's been a great solution, much needed in the Canadian marketplace. And I think it's an area that will become more and more popular with as technology plays a more critical role in legal in the legal space, whether in house or in private practice, but also from the learnings that come with it, processes that are to. It's not just technology itself, but how do we implement it? How do we affect the change management that comes with it? And your conference are great for it, and I highly recommend them to anyone in the audience.
Thank you, Gary, and likewise, pleasure to be on today's podcast, and also, to partner with Alexa Translations on our series, and a lot of common ground, and enjoy working with you and the team at Alexa.
Thank you again for joining us today, Andrew.
Thanks, Gary.